Hello, this is Deb Calvert with People First Productivity Solutions. I'd like to welcome you to part 2 in our 4-part series related to negotiating fundamentals. Even though these skills we're discussing are very fundamental, they're absolutely appropriate for intermediate and advanced negotiators as well. In field, as I do sales observations, what I frequently find is that mistakes made in negotiation are almost always related to the fundamentals we're discussing in this 4-part series. Each of the 4 parts is just 30 minutes in length in a webinar format. In part 1, we took a look at the importance of value in negotiation, and I really recommend, if you didn't already, that you go back and start there because value is so critical in every part of the negotiation. In this, the second part of the series, we'll be talking about conflict styles and how by knowing your own preferred conflict style and the style that others are using, you can be all the more effective adapting your style accordingly. In part 3, we'll be looking at some additional negotiating terms as well as some strategies that are commonly used. And if you're negotiating with people who have a great deal of experience, right on up to those who might be the hired guns that your customers bring in, you'll find that that session is really relevant and helpful for understanding the fundamentals of strategic negotiation. Finally, in our 4th part of the series, we'll be looking at questions that you need to ask in order to be as effective as possible in the negotiation. So here in part 2, as I said, we're going to focus on conflict styles. Conflict styles have to do with the natural modes, we each have them, the natural tendencies that we choose when we find ourselves under pressure and in any situation that's conflict-laden. Just like we said in our last session, it's so important to understand the other party's point of view, in that case, point of view related to value. And here, it's also very important to understand not only your own conflict style, but also the tendencies or natural preferences when it comes to conflict. And when you do understand both your own and the other party's approach to conflict, you'll just be able to be more effective both in preparing for and actually conducting the negotiation. Now, what you're looking at here is what research tells us are the 5 different types of conflict, and there are behaviors associated with each one of these types. So let me explain what you're looking at here. In essence, for these 5 primary conflict styles, we want to look at 2 different axes. The first one here is the assertiveness. Assertiveness has to do with how much you are asserting your own as opposed to how much you are withholding your own preferences and needs. So you'll see here we've got 2 dimensions of conflict, 2 styles of conflict that are described as being highly assertive, 2 that are described as being low in terms of assertiveness, so not placing your own needs at the higher priority, and then 1 that's described as being sort of middle ground. You are looking to have both your needs and the needs of the other party in balance. The other dimension going along this horizontal axis is related to cooperativeness. And that would be how much are you looking to interact and work with the other party as opposed to how much are you looking to your own agenda only. So in addition to how you represent your needs, how cooperative are you in trying to balance those needs? And again, we have 2 that are described as being highly cooperative, 2 that are described as being low in terms of cooperativeness, and 1 which is medium. When we put all of this together, you end up with 5 different ways of coming into a negotiation or a conflict. The first one is represented by being highly assertive, but low in cooperativeness, so a high regard for your own needs and desires and a disinterest in being cooperative to consider the other party's needs. And this form of conflict would be considered to be competing. You could describe competing as the old phrase which is might makes right. And so wanting to be very overpowering, to be winning each point of the negotiation, that style is competing. Over here below competing, still on the left-hand side, we've got a low degree of assertiveness. So unlike competing, this is where you are not putting a great deal of emphasis on your needs, nor are you putting emphasis around the desire to cooperate with others. You're pretty much just stepping back. That's why this is called avoiding. And this is, as all of these are, a legitimate style of conflict. This is something that in the right time and in the right way has a place within negotiation. So we'll talk about that. You're probably having a strong reaction as I review these to at least one of them. And the one that you're reacting strongly to, probably it's going to tell you something about yourself, your own personal preference, and maybe your own pet peeve. But as we go through this, our aim is going to be to know when and how to use all 5 of these conflict styles. Somebody who is choosing avoiding might describe it as a situation where you should just leave well enough alone. We're not going to have any conflict. We're not going to engage in this conversation. It's just something that you are choosing to back away from. That would be an avoiding mode of conflict. In the middle here, medium assertiveness and medium cooperativeness, we call that compromising. And that's where you might describe the situation as, let's just split the difference. It is, in fact, the most common type of negotiation. It's what people, in fact, value and think they should do in a negotiating situation. But as you can see here with 4 other types, if you are compromising and you run up against somebody who's competing, avoiding, accommodating, or collaborating, you're going to miss out on some opportunities, and you certainly could also be taken advantage of. Compromising, like all the other 5 on this list, has its time and its place. It has a value, and it also has a way that it can be the wrong approach. So all that to come. Here in the lower right-hand corner, this particular conflict style is accommodating, and it's where you have a high degree of cooperativeness. You really, really want to work with the other person, so much so that you might be very low in asserting your own needs. Kill 'em with kindness is the way that I'm going to choose to describe accommodating. And then finally, we've got this one known as collaborating. It's both high in assertiveness, wanting to make sure that your needs are met, high in cooperativeness, wanting to make sure the needs of the other party are met and that you're really working together. And it comes in with the philosophy that 2 heads are better than 1. A couple of things to consider. So as you're still looking at this screen, considering these 5 styles, some things that you want to consider as you're getting acquainted with each one of these styles. The first would be to consider, what style do you tend to use? And you can probably identify that for yourself pretty readily. Think about a time when you're in a conflict situation or in the midst of a negotiation. We all have a preference that we revert to in those times of stress. And remember, right, there's no judgment. There are no rights and no wrongs when it comes to style. There's just an appropriate time and way to use each of these styles. You don't want to go only to the one that's most comfortable for you. So knowing your own preference, first of all, that's going to give you a clue about what you're most likely going to be doing. And the next step then would be to stretch yourself so that you are using the conflict style that is most appropriate to the situation rather than the one that just comes naturally to you. The second thing to think about after you've sort of identified for yourself your own preferred style, right behind that, what style does the other party in this negotiation seem to prefer? Which style do they seem to be using right now as you're in the thick of the negotiation? You'll need to respond differently to various styles. So when you know what someone prefers and uses most often, you have an advantage because you can prepare yourself for a response that will match and be most effective in response to their style. Now, someone who's very well versed in negotiating skills, right, they're going to be responsive to you, and they're going to mix up their styles to try to get the reactions that they're looking for. So you want to stay nimble. On the next slides, I'll be showing you how to use each one of these styles and how to respond as others use each of these styles too. The third thing then, you've thought about your own style and preference. Secondly, you thought about what the other party's preference seems to be. The third thing to think about is what style is going to be most effective in this situation. So at the very same time that you're assessing the other party's style, you want to keep in mind your objectives and the things that you value most in the negotiation. You may have to remind yourself multiple times that being effective is superior to being comfortable in your own conflict style. What we'll do next is we'll take a closer look at each one of these styles. And as we do, we'll talk about the games people play with these styles and what to do about that. And for those of you who deal with professional negotiators, it may be particularly useful to recognize and react to each of these styles as a set of behaviors and not as an emotion. The truth is, the emotions for each of the people that you encounter in conflict are the same, right? What we're looking at here is nothing more than a difference in how those feelings are expressed. So just to illustrate that point, let's say someone really is angry. It's not an act, but they really are angry in a negotiation. Anger can be expressed in any of these ways. Some people, when they're very angry, they withdraw and they appear to be avoiding. Avoiding is the behavior. Others, when they're very angry, they become really competitive and they want to win at all costs. But the baseline emotion, anger, is the same, so we're not going to deal with the emotion. We're going to deal with the behaviors that are exhibited in these 5 different ways. One by one, then we'll start with avoiding. Avoiding, what I mean here is the behaviors that appear as if someone is sidestepping or postponing or withdrawing from the negotiation in some way. The obvious disadvantage of avoiding is that neither party is going to be able to get their needs met. Many people think that avoiding is never a good choice in negotiation or in conflict, but we've all experienced a negotiator who chooses to avoid the negotiation. So we can't ignore this as a viable choice or a choice that at least others might make. There are times when the other party, especially a savvy negotiator, will choose avoiding because the delay of a decision or the delay of a call back to you makes you react in a way that gives them an advantage. Avoiding makes them seem less interested, less invested, and it makes you feel an intensity of interest. So the balance of power is shifted if someone is not actively engaging. Well, here are some times then when you might deliberately choose to avoid a negotiation or a part of a negotiation. If issues are not important to you, you might just choose to avoid those. Avoiding those gives you the upper hand later on if those were issues that truly were important to the other party. The balance of power shifts to your side when you are less focused on things that really don't matter to you. If there's absolutely no chance that your needs are going to be met, that's a time when you might choose to avoid negotiating on those points. Why burn up a lot of time and energy if your needs are not going to be met? Or maybe you want to signal that you don't see this going in the direction you want it to, so you have withdrawn from it and you need something to change. And you might even be clear in communicating, until we can move forward on this, there's really nothing else for us to talk about. Those are instances when avoiding a part of the negotiation gives you the time, the space, and forces the other party to think about something that you need them to think about. Now, please know that you don't want to do this in a way that's an overused manipulation. The kinds of things I'm talking about here, you get one shot with them, and if you continually disengage and avoid and use this so that it appears to be very manipulative, of course you're going to shut down not only the negotiation, but potentially the relationship. So you got to use these with care. Another time to consider avoiding in a negotiation is when the cost of conflict is simply too high. If the other party is coming in highly competitive and the only responses that you have a choice to make are to also be highly competitive or perhaps to pull back, Maybe you feel like the cost of conflict is simply too high to you, to the relationship, and so you avoid instead to give some time and space and let things cool off. There will be times when you need to delay a decision. You have other people who need to be involved. You need to gather other information. Whatever the case may be, delaying a decision is a valid reason for avoiding a part of a negotiation. I think whenever you can, it's a good idea to communicate why you're avoiding. So to be able to say, I have a decision that I need to delay because X, Y, and Z need to happen, right? That's certainly friendlier and is going to keep things moving forward better for you if you've explained why. And then finally, you might choose to avoid issues that just aren't related to the core of the negotiation. You never want the things that are tangential to take the focus away from what really does matter in the negotiation. So you might intentionally avoid those side issues that seem to be thrown in. Okay, now if this is your preferred style, you have a tendency, let's say, to avoid conflict, then a word of caution, there's a couple things that you need to know. You don't want to go here too quickly is the first one, because if you're looking for excuses, if you just saw that list of 5 things that I said, here's when you might want to use this style, and you felt like you were getting a safe out, be careful, because you don't want to go here first. You're going to want to try other methods of negotiating, other methods of conflict style before you retreat. If this is your natural style and you're going to go here, just recognize that you might go here too quickly and that this should not be your first choice. More often it should be a last choice that you make. And then secondly, people who prefer to avoid conflict often overcompensate when they feel pressed to respond before they're ready. So whether this is you or the other party, overcompensating in this case means that you are staying in the low cooperativeness part of our grid, but then you may amp up your assertiveness because you're feeling pressed. And that would take you, or it could push the other party directly into the box called competing. And that may not be the direction that you want to go. Competing usually comes across as being very aggressive, highly self-focused. It feels like the negotiation could break down because someone is being entirely self-centered. So that's why I say it may not be the direction that you want to go. Instead, you want to consider responding in a manner that will be effective based on objective reasoning rather than allowing your emotions to steer you into a place where you don't want to go. Okay, so that was avoiding. Let's talk about the box that was over to the right of that, in the lower right-hand part of our box, and this is the one known as accommodating. And I would describe accommodating behaviors as the ones that sublimate or defer or may even cause you to neglect getting your own needs met because you're so eager to satisfy the needs of the other party. Generally, this is viewed, especially by the person who is being accommodating, as generous and yielding to someone else. It's usually viewed, though, by others as an adopted position of meekness or even weakness. So we've got to be careful with this. If this is your preferred natural style, the cautionary flag for you is not to go here too quickly, because it may not be in anyone's best interest for you to be accommodating. Certainly it may feel good, and it may be even the right thing to do to give in, but are you truly giving in such a way that it benefits the other party? Or are you potentially and unintentionally robbing them of something greater than what they end up with? Okay, so we got to think about here, what's the right way to accommodate, and are we motivated by the right things in this accommodating style? Acquiescing to others can be useful. Remember, with all the styles, there's a right time and way to do this. So think about acquiescing to others in a way that's productive if it is in a situation where you realize, in fact, that you're wrong, or if the issue itself is much more important to the other party than it is to you. If they care a lot about something and it makes virtually no difference to you whether it goes one way or the other, then sure, this is a great way to accommodate them. When you do that, you'll actually build up some social credits. It's like having a little money in the bank that you can come back and access later when the reverse is true and something matters more to you than it does to the other party. The other time to accommodate, and the place where you might overdo it if you're not careful, but it may be the right thing to use an accommodating style in order to preserve harmony. Preserving harmony signals that the relationship is important to you. And so especially for customers that you will do business with on a regular basis, or for those who you work directly with as opposed to it being a third-party negotiator, you certainly want to be considerate of the relationship and in keeping that relationship intact. Now, professional negotiators, they often use accommodating techniques to lull the other party into a false sense of safety. It can be very disarming to have someone give in to your initial requests. And then the whammy comes because the professional negotiator has already given in on several points, so you may be afraid that you'll look like a jerk if you don't reciprocate. You have to remember that not all parts of a negotiation are created equally. So don't accept concessions that you don't really want or need at the beginning. Just, make a note of those and say you'll come back to them. And when you are asked to make a concession, what you'll have then are bargaining chips instead of favors that you've already accepted. See, this is another reason why it's really important to know the other party's hierarchy of value, something we talked about in the first part of this series. If you were unable to determine it before the actual negotiation, then this technique will reveal it to you. So keep a log of what doesn't matter, the things that they are willingly acting accommodating about, as well as a list of the things that do seem to matter. If you're keeping score and not making commitments, then you will have good information to be able to work with. Not taking or giving at the beginning of the negotiation means that you will have time to gather information that is useful. The third conflict style that you'll see coming out in a negotiation is the one called competing. It was in the upper left-hand corner of our diagram. Competing is the one that's the most power-oriented. It looks and feels that way certainly to everyone who's involved. And when you think about competing as a conflict style, probably what's coming to mind to you is that stereotypical hardball negotiator. Maybe you've heard of a guy named Lemuel Boulware. Boulware is credited with being the classic example of a competing style negotiator. The take-it-or-leave-it approach is even called Boulwareism, named after him. Here's what he did to earn this distinction. This was in 1960, and Boulware was scheduled to sit down to negotiate with a labor union. Boulware was, at that time, the vice president for General Electric, and he held off until the very last day of this negotiation period. He showed up late, he walked into the room, he did not sit down, and he said simply this. He said, "This is my first offer, my last offer, and my best offer." And then he left the room. He didn't budge from that offer. He did this for the next 5 years in each annual negotiation until the unions were able to get his actions before the Supreme Court. Since there was no actual negotiation that he was allowing, he was held in violation of bargaining laws. But his approach, even to this day, is not uncommon. And you will encounter negotiators who open with this stance or who resort to it later on in a negotiation. Their intent is intimidation. And in fact, This is the very reason that some companies hire third-party negotiators, and that this has become more commonplace than it used to be. Companies know, the people who do business directly with you know, that they would not be able to preserve a relationship with you at the same time that they solely focus on their own concerns, even at your expense, in a negotiation. So they insert a middleman who has zero interest in developing or preserving a relationship with you. Now, when you're confronted with a competing style, your immediate response may be to respond in kind. And in some cases, that may be the correct approach. But use these criteria that I'll talk about in just a moment instead of your gut reaction of anger or your I'll show you kinds of feelings. To be effective, adopt a competing style when you need to have a quick, decisive decision. If action has to take place right away, then yes, you may have to go head-to-head in a competing style. Or if you have to implement an unpopular course of action and there's no way that anybody's going to come out happy, then a competing style to drive it through may be your only course of action. If there are non-negotiable issues, you truly don't have any room for concessions. You cannot change things. There is not going to be any ability whatsoever for compromise. In those situations, you've got to drive it through exactly as is. Then your competing style may be the appropriate one at those times. And then finally, if you are up against another party who is competing and who clearly has demonstrated that they will take advantages of any acquiescence that you allow, right? If it's going to be toe-to-toe, head-to-head, and they've already made that clear, then to protect yourself in those situations, you may have to go into this power-oriented mood, which is very much a mode of being selfish to preserve whatever it is you need to absolutely preserve. Now, if competing is your own naturally preferred style, then you really want to be careful here to consider how the other party is likely to respond if you are all competing all the time. Even if you are successful in intimidating them or in winning the negotiation, consider what you might be losing in terms of the relationship and the goodwill. In other words, save this style for extreme situations so that you are not viewed as unreasonable or overly aggressive. The next style to talk about was the one that fell right there in the middle. It was the one that we said had a medium amount of assertiveness and a medium amount of cooperativeness both. Now you may have heard, and there certainly is training out there that says, that compromise is essential in all negotiations. And I don't personally believe that that's an accurate statement. And I certainly don't think it's the healthiest perspective to enter into a negotiation with. Because by its very nature, compromising falls short of fully satisfying either party. With compromise, everyone gives up something, and both parties only get some of their needs met. When there are unmet needs that linger, customers begin to look for other solutions to fill those gaps. And when there are gaps, relationships can be impaired instead of being enriched. So this is a serious caution that I want to give you. It's one that often gets overlooked in an effort to expediently conclude a negotiation. So compromise is something that is highly valued in business, but it's also something that you want to have an appropriate amount of thought around, rather than being quick to pat yourself on the back for an expedient compromise. I really want you to consider what needs have not been met for me, and more importantly, what needs did this compromise mean were not met for my customer? Because those needs, that gap, opens up opportunities potentially to your competitors. Now, a savvy negotiator will assume that you value compromise, because most people in business are conditioned to think this is the way to go about negotiating. So they will front load their demands and make it seem that they are compromising with you by giving up some of those initial demands. That's called log rolling. If you haven't prepared in the same way, if you don't have logs to roll, concessions that you are able to make easily, what you'll end up doing is giving up something that's of meaningful value, while they'll give up something that was merely padding. If your own preferred style and habit is to compromise, then you should consider what needs are being left unmet before you willingly go that route. Think about, for the other party, were those real needs or were they logs that were rolled? Did they give up something that really mattered to them or something that was just padding? And what's the underlying and ongoing dissatisfaction about what's been given up in order to meet in the so-called middle? And what are the likely consequences of leaving those needs unmet? It's important that you think about those things not after the negotiation has concluded, but ideally before the negotiation, during the negotiation, and it is fair, in fact, to put those things right on the table, to say, I understand that compromise would be expedient and that we could walk away from this deal in 5 minutes if we made this compromise. But before we do, I really want to talk about the implications and the unintended consequences if we take that step. Now, like any style, there is a right time and a right way to compromise. So think about it this way, that the right time to compromise would be if the goals for you and the other party are moderately important. Not minimally important, because those were going to be just log-rolled concessions anyway, and not of the utmost importance, because you should never compromise on the things that matter the most. But if you're both giving up something that's only moderately important, that might be a time to consider compromising. Another time to consider compromising is when the goals are mutually exclusive. There's no way that you can have your goals and the goals of the other party satisfactorily met because they cancel each other out. If it is impossible for both of you to get what you want, then that might be an appropriate time to compromise. A great way to use compromising is if you're coming to terms about something that's a temporary fix. So you're able to say, you know what, because we're under some time pressure here, or because we do want to move forward, let's go ahead and agree to meet in the middle on this point and reconvene in 6 weeks so that we can create a better, longer-term solution. So compromising and making sure that you have stated that that is a temporary fix is a great way to be able to expedite something happening without giving up everything else that needs to happen. This last choice, the one that was in the upper right-hand corner of the grid that we looked at, is the conflict and negotiating style known as collaborating. Now let me start by explaining the difference between compromise and collaborate. Remember that compromise takes something away. Both parties give something up. But in collaboration, instead of giving anything up, what we're doing is adding to, and adding to the terms and the negotiation for both parties. I'll give you an illustration of this on the next slide to really drive home what I'm talking about. But let me first say that collaboration is the preferred style of negotiating. Whenever you have a desire to form a partnership, or if there is a need to satisfy both parties fully, collaboration is the place that you want to start. And at least give it a try, because you've got 4 other options. If you are unable to collaborate, then you have compromising as a backup. If you're unable to collaborate and the other party gets highly competitive, you have a choice to either compete or avoid. If you start collaborating and that's not working and you have to give a few things up, you might choose to become more accommodating. But this is the starting point, because when you are collaborating, not only do you fully satisfy both parties, but you have an opportunity to get creative, to enlarge the conversation, which may even enlarge the partnership in full. Now, collaboration is essential if both parties have important needs, because remember, we said you don't want to compromise when important needs are on the table. And collaboration is essential if you are trying to form a larger relationship, if you're trying to look at something from a broader perspective, and if you really want to gain long-term, highly partnered commitment, collaboration is the right approach. Please note that professional third-party negotiators almost never choose this style because it's not in their best interest to do so. Right? They've been sent in to get this deal, just this very narrow, specific deal done. And they may not have, they probably don't have, the authority or the knowledge to expand the dialogue beyond the original scope of the negotiation. There is a great Xhosa tribal saying that's frequently used by Nelson Mandela, and I'll translate it. His saying is, "You can do nothing if you do not get the support of other people." You can do nothing if you do not get the support of other people is a great way of looking at collaboration. Collaboration enables you to do a whole lot more than nothing. Compromise allows you to do something, but in order to do as many things as possible, we enlarge this to be a collaboration. Collaboration is a really powerful way to gain other support. It is, I'll acknowledge, it is more difficult and more time-consuming to complete than a negotiation that focuses on compromise. Now, if you have a style that is more naturally collaborative, you know what I'm talking about. You probably get excited by bigger picture possibilities, and you probably enjoy solving multiple problems when you see ways to layer into a conversation that started out smaller. Others may not get what you're doing initially. And you might sort of enjoy that too, that whole process of opening them up to all these other possibilities. So if this is your preference, just remember it's not the only approach. It is the best approach to start with, but if there is a serious time restriction, if there's a very limited opportunity, don't get swept up in trying to make something bigger that may just frustrate others. Okay, now I said I would elaborate on this and try to give you an example. So for those times when collaborating does make sense, here are some things to think about. First of all, collaborating, we said, requires you to understand and consider enlarging the ZOPA, or the Zone of Potential Agreement. And that's what I've illustrated here. This would be you, Party 1. This is the person that you're negotiating with, Party 2. The only place where you're going to come to any agreement is where you overlap. This in negotiating is known as the ZOPA, the Zone of Potential Agreement. Now, this could be as simple as just an overlap between reservation prices. The reservation, or also called the walkaway price, that's something that you should predetermine before you go into the negotiation. It is the minimum amount that you would be willing to accept the other party paying to you, or said differently, it's the maximum amount you would be willing to pay in a negotiation. At whichever point, the minimum or maximum, that it's no longer desirable to you, that's your walkaway. It's also known as your reservation price. So the overlap between you and the other party might be as simple as the place where your walkaway prices are intersecting. Okay, so let me give you a scenario with a reservation price in mind. Let's say your buyer is willing to spend up to $300,000, and you will take no less than $250,000. The ZOPA then, the Zone of Potential Agreement, is that $50,000 margin in between there. And both parties will be amenable to make a final agreement within that space. We want to enlarge. Collaboration is all about enlarging, so if we can enlarge the agreement overall, we might also be able to enlarge the overlap between those prices because concessions and value-added elements of the deal, something else is added in to make the overlap of these two circles larger. Collaborative negotiation, in some circles you'll see that known as called integrative negotiation, because we're looking to integrate the needs of both parties. Collaborative or integrative negotiation, the whole idea of that is to expand the zone of potential agreement. That may involve offering some deal sweeteners so that you meet additional needs of the other party. It's all about creating value and looking for mutual wins. Obviously, the larger the ZOPA, the more likely it is that an agreement will be reached that both parties can feel good about. Okay, so you should ask yourself, right, what are some of the ways that you could use collaboration or integrative negotiating to expand the zone of potential agreement? In other words, what deal sweeteners do you already use? What additional ones could you use? Now, I should point out to you that these are most effective when the customer's needs are well understood, and the deal sweeteners you choose are very relevant and meaningful to this specific customer. That's why deal sweeteners, even though you put them out there, may not even enlarge the ZOPA. Because if they're not enticing to that other customer, the other party, then they do not create a larger zone of potential agreement. Okay, that's one of the reasons why we started this series by talking about value and how important it is to understand precisely what the other party values. Collaboration expands the zone of potential agreement by thinking outside the box of the narrow negotiation that you may have started with. Elevating the conversation to include more discovery of needs and to reveal more about your own needs too takes time and trust. Usually there's a need, if you're collaboratively negotiating, a need to put multiple issues out there on the table. The reason most negotiations don't make it to this level is that one or both parties will be unwilling to invest the time or to risk the trust. But research bears out that collaborating is absolutely the most effective, even though it's the least used, it is the most effective form of negotiation. It does satisfy both parties at a higher level. It creates longer-term relationships and loyalty, and it results in bigger deals being made. So don't rule this approach out. When you have significant opportunity to create partnerships, start here and try to expand that zone of potential agreement. So let me give you an example, something that you might be able to relate to. Let's say you want a raise, and at the same time, without you knowing it, your boss has been asked to equalize pay at your job level, and you're already at the high end. So her target number and your target number don't overlap. You decide to broaden this conversation because you want to see if there's just any potential at all for expanding the zone of potential agreement, which was minimal or none when you walked in. So you ask your boss about growth targets and expansion plans, and you ask about unmet staffing needs that are associated with the expansion within your company. And you ask about what the consequences of meeting those needs might be. So she engages, you have some great dialogue, and within that, your boss begins to ask you about your longer-term career goals and maybe even asks your opinions about how to expand more rapidly and your threshold for taking on more responsibility too. And over time, because of this conversation that was all over the board, much bigger than just how much money you make, over time you both conclude that you may be able to take on a larger role, one that meets your career needs and your goals, and it also satisfies what you're asking for in terms of a salary increase. What your boss gets out of it is that it accelerates her execution of the expansion plan that she's being held accountable for. With that broader discussion, you both found a way to expand the zone of potential agreement, and you were able to collaborate to find something that was mutually satisfying, much bigger than what you originally came in to negotiate about. Okay, so in that example, obviously the narrow conversation about a raise, it was going to go nowhere. There was no place for it to go because there was no zone of potential agreement. Questions, however, revealed a potential opportunity, and created higher level value for both parties. Now, when we get to part 4 of this series, we will talk about questions that can yield this type of information. First, though, we need to cover more about your own position within the negotiation, so that's what we're going to be moving to next and covering in part 3 of the series. Of course, looking back here at part 2, it is very, very helpful to understand conflict styles and how they're used deliberately and naturally in negotiations. You being adaptable means that you will be more effective in the negotiation. Recognizing how others may use conflict style gives you confidence and control that you may not otherwise have in a negotiation. In part 3, as I said, we will talk about positioning. We'll be talking about framing the discussion and setting your own limits so that you can be effective in the heat of negotiation. I'd also like to encourage you, in addition to coming back for parts 3 and 4 of the series, to take a look at our website, People First PS. On that website, you'll find a lot of great resources that are built to help sellers. They're all at no cost. We're also open and interested in hearing your feedback about what other resources would be useful for you. But we've got webinars, podcasts, our radio program is archived there. We also have blogs and white papers and research. Just many, many things that are right there to help you as a seller. It's all free. It's all been field tested. It's all relevant and current to the work you're doing. So thank you very much for attending this workshop brought to you by People First Productivity Solutions.